Thank you, Omer, for your talk. Professor Kai Struve will hold the next lecture. Professor Kai Struve is a privat docent at the Institute of History at Martin Luther University in Halle, Germany. He received his PhD from the Freie Universität of Berlin and held previous positions at the Herder Institute in Marburg and the Simon Dubnow Institute in Leipzig, as well as visiting fellowships in the US, France, and Poland. Among his publications are the books Deutsche Herrschaft, Ukrainischer Nationalismus, Antijüdische Gewalt, der Sommer 1941 in der Westukraine, published in 2015, or Bauern und Nation in Galicia, der Zugehörigkeit und soziale Emanzipation in 19. Jahrhundert, published in 2005, or Shared History, Divided Memory, Jews and Others in Soviet-occupied Poland, 1939-1941, published in 2007. Professor Struve's lecture is titled German Pogroms, Atrocities of Waffen-SS Division Wiking in July 1941. Kai, the screen is yours.
Yes, I would thank you very much for the, can you hear me? Yes, I have no.
Yes, but open your
yes.
nicht. Couldn't see you.
Yes, I'm opening my.
We can see your presentation, but we cannot see you. If you can open your camera, it would be better.
Yes, I tried it, but it says that I can't start it because the host has stopped it.
Autobaya, it's the same problem, by the way.
Sorry, yeah, now maybe it works. Yeah, now it works. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. You can see my screen now also, yes? Okay. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and introduction. I will give in my talk yes, the attempt of a short summary of the article that has been published in the Moreshet volume. This article is on this controversial questions of pogroms during the first weeks after the German attack of the Soviet Union on 22nd of June 1941. That is in this earlier study that this book about 1941 that Marcus also mentioned. I have basically argued that there were three main central contexts of these anti-Jewish violence, these pogroms, and yes, that we need in a way a more complex understanding of what happened there, and that it would be not really adequate understanding to see them simply as spontaneous, rather uniform outbreaks of violence from the local population. As I said, I have distinguished there are three main contexts. I will give a short intro shortly at the beginning of my talk. Now I will say some words, rather short, in a short way, about two of the contexts where the violence mostly originated from the local population or from some specific groups. And then in the rest of my, and that is the central subject of the article and also of my talk, I will focus on the third context, and that are pogroms by the, what I think acts of violence that can be called pogroms by a German unit of the Waffen-SS, the SS division Wiking. The first two contexts you can see also on this slide. Yes, I think, as I said, I think this understanding or concept of this anti-Jewish violence in this period as largely spontaneous outbreaks of anti-Semitic hatred from the mid of the population is in a way misleading. And based on an analysis of the events in several dozens localities in Eastern Galicia, my conclusion was rather that there are at the core of these acts of anti-Jewish violence were groups of anti-Soviet nationalist insurgents. In Western Ukraine, they belonged to the organization or originated from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, the organization that Omar already mentioned. But this was not different also in other parts of the Western Soviet Union, where other nationalist organizations were active, and where also pogroms, acts of anti-Jewish violence from local sides occurred. The OUN and also these other groups, they cooperated with the German military intelligence, the Abwehr, already before the 22nd of June 1941, and attacked Soviet forces from behind when the German invasion began. But one of their own aims was also the creation, the foundation of local administration and local militias as a step towards state building. And here then there were two central contexts of their involvement in anti-Jewish violence. One were reckonings of these insurgent groups, the local militias, with those whom they considered to have been supporters of Soviet rule or traitors during the previous 21 months of the Soviet occupation. In many localities, they did not kill only Jews, but also Ukrainians and Poles, who in their view had committed crimes by cooperating and supporting the Soviets. However, based on the stereotypical view of Jews as supporters of Soviet rule, mostly Jews were murdered. Usually such killings happened in smaller localities where no German or in the southeast of Galicia, Hungarian troops were present. In testimonies of Jewish survivors, these acts of violence often are described as pogroms. However, in all cases that I could analyze more closely, there are clear indications that these killings were not so much spontaneous outbreaks of violence, but rather planned, targeted acts of murder of certain individuals or families. And the second important context that had a rather strong influence on our perception of or understand or the common image that exists of these pogroms were attacks on Jews during the retrieval of corpses of prison inmates whom the NKVD personnel had murdered before their retreat. That is also the context that Omar already mentioned. And the largest of these such Soviet mass murder had occurred, taken place in Struve, where about 2,500 inmates of different prisons had been murdered in the last days of June 1941. Yes, and here and the central context that was that the Germans ordered the local Ukrainian militia to bring Jews to the prisons, who then had to retrieve the victims of this German mass murder. And here there was violence from the side of the militia, but also more strongly than in many other places, participation of civilians in the violence. And here they became these excesses against Jews became also a kind of public spectacles, and that was also the case in some other places, as for example Boleslav, Zambia, or Drohobych. I will now continue with the third context, and that will be the focus of my talk. And this was the context with the most victims in absolute, and when one looks at the different localities, also in relative numbers. And that is the atrocities in 6 localities where the core group of perpetrators were not from the local population, but from the Waffen-SS division Wiking. Here between 4,300 and 7,000 Jews perished within 4 days between the 3rd and the 6th of July, 1941. Previous research has interpreted most of these atrocities only or primarily as Ukrainian pogroms. In fact, in all localities, also local Ukrainian militias and civilians participated in the violence, but the core group of perpetrators came from the Waffen-SS. Only because of their participation, the violence here was much more deadly than attacks on Jews in other localities. And in 2 localities, Zolochev and Ternopil, the violence was also related to the retrieval of the corpses of murdered prison inmates. The Waffen-SS division Wiking was, like 5 other Waffen-SS divisions, and in contrast to other units of SS and police, part of the combat troops. The division was subordinated to the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, specifically the Panzergruppe 1, Tank Group 1, and it was trained and equipped as a military combat unit. It had been newly deployed in the end of 1940 and was the first Waffen-SS division that included also non-German, so-called Germanic volunteers from Finland, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. In summer 1941, about 8 to 10% of the personnel came from these countries. The Waffen-SS troops saw themselves as military elite of the National Socialist state, and their recruits were also volunteers. They were not forcibly drafted as the soldiers of the Wehrmacht. At least this was the case in 1941. And the Wiking division did not take part in the initial German attack of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, but followed in the second line of troops. It became involved in major battles only further to the east in the region of the former Soviet-Polish border. However, parts of Wiking were involved already before in skirmishes with some remnants of Soviet troops east of Lviv on 1st of July and during the following days. And in the morning of the 2nd of July, the commander of the regiment Westland, one of 3 regiments of this division, Hilmar Weckerle, was shot here by a sniper. And the death of Weckerle may have been one additional trigger for unleashing excessive violence, both against Soviet prisoners of the war and against Jews. Rumors spread that among the unit, the Jews were responsible for the death of their commander. And the Wehrmacht units reported about yes, and this death of the commander had happened at a small town near east on the road towards the east from Lviv, east of Lviv. And from this region, there are reports from different Wehrmacht units that about this 2nd of July, when their commander was shot, that there was that the Waffen-SS troops were shooting Jews and also prisoners of war. However, the first larger massacre took place in the first city at the road that Wiking reached after this the death of this commander had happened, and that is Zolochew, Swartchow in Polish. Zolochew had been occupied after heavy fighting by other Wehrmacht units on the 1st of July. And soon afterwards, 2 mass graves were found here in the yard of a large Soviet prison in an old castle on the outskirts of the city. Later, about 650 corpses were exhumed here. The next day, on the 2nd of July, a new Ukrainian city administration was established and a local Ukrainian militia had been created. As in most other localities, the militia had been organized by the OUN, and they had also, and the OUN had also a strong influence in the local administration. First units of Wiking arrived in Zolochew in the late afternoon of the 2nd of July, and some atrocities against Jews took place already on that evening. But on the 3rd of July, the next day, the violence escalated into mass murder. In Zolochew, as in Lviv and other localities, the central context was that Jews were brought in large numbers to the prison buildings, where they were forced to retrieve the murdered prison inmates from the mass graves. The Waffen-SS men, together with members of the Ukrainian militia, took Jews from their apartments and led them to the prison building. Soon, as in Lviv, also civilians participated in this. Jews were beaten and killed here, already in apartments or on the streets. However, the actual mass murder took place in the yard of the prison building. Here, Jews had to take out the corpses of the murdered inmates from the mass graves. They were beaten and many killed, both by soldiers of the Wiking division, members of the militia, and by civilians. Apparently, the Wiking soldiers encouraged also the militia and the local population to violence. Nevertheless, most were killed when Wiking members started to shoot the Jews with machine guns in one of the mass graves in the prison yard from which they had taken out the corpses of the murdered prison inmates. The killings continued also the next morning. They were stopped then around noon of the 4th of July on the intervention of officers from an infantry division of the Wehrmacht that passed the city. However, there are clear indications that the local Wehrmacht authorities had given their consent, or at least not attempted to stop the violence before. At least 1,000 Jews and maybe more were killed in Zolochew. The next massacre, and on the map I have here the different localities, put the different localities where such massacres took place, and that you can see that these were all places that were the major road to the east, where the German troops moved at that time. And the next massacres after Zolochew took place in Struve and Ozerna, on 4th and 5th of July, 2 small towns east of Zolochew at the road to Ternopil. Here also all male Jews whom the SS units could find were assembled and then shot. Part of this were mockeries and cruelties. Local Ukrainian militias supported the Wiking men in assembling the Jews, but in contrast to Zolochew, sources do not report that they or civilians murdered Jews. In Struve, between 600 and 815 men were killed, and in Ozerna, between 180 and 200. However, the largest massacre took place in Ternopil, in Polish Tarnopol, the third largest city in eastern Galicia, with about 40,000 inhabitants. Also here, about 560 inmates of a Soviet prison had been shot, and the corpses were found in the prison building. Parts of Division Wiking arrived here in the afternoon of 3rd of July, and others on 4th of July. And 4th and 5th of July were the main days of the pogrom. but killings happened also during the following days. The sources clearly show that the SS troops systematically searched the city for male Jews. Many were also killed on the streets, and some streets were strewn with corpses. Others were driven to several assembly points in the city where they were shot. Many Jews were also brought to the prison building where they had to retrieve the murdered inmates and were mistreated and killed. Also, synagogues were burned down, and SS men threw hand grenades in apartments of Jews. And as one witness described the scenes he saw later, they were shooting Jews as if it was a hunting expedition. Also here, the local administration, militia, and civilians participated in the violence, but as in the other localities, the main perpetrators were the members of the Waffen-SS. Probably up to 4,000 Jews were killed in these days. This was by far the largest massacre in the region. However, the enormous massacre in Ternopil did not end the bloody raids of Wiking through Galicia yet. Moving towards the front line at the former Polish-Soviet border, parts of Wiking's regiment Westland devastated at least 2 more small-town Jewish communities at the road from Ternopil to Husiatin. The town of Skalat suffered from 2 different raids of Viking units that passed the city on the 5th and 6th of July. The most devastating was that on 6th of July. The Viking men assembled several hundred male Jews on the marketplace. The Jews were mocked and many also killed by the SS men, but also by members of the local militia and inhabitants. In the evening, many were shot in the ruins of a local castle. Estimates about the number of victims are between 350 and 600. The massacre in Shimalev took place in the next town took place at the same days, also on the 5th and 6th of July, and that is one of the rare photo documents that are from the small towns. One from this massacre in Shimalev that shows some of the victims. Many were shot at a pond, and that is there are also some additional sources about these killings at these ponds and at this pond, and there are some of the victims also in this photograph. Yes, and in the Shimalev there were 350 to 500 victims probably. Yes, I will now come to my concluding remarks. Summation of the above mentioned likely numbers of victims in the different localities results into between 4,300 and about 7,000 who had been killed during the violent excesses of Waffen-SS Division Wiking between the 3rd and 6th of July 1941. Jews who had been shot alongside the roads and whose numbers are difficult to establish have not been included here. There are hints that Jews had been killed by the Waffen-SS also in other localities of the region, though in smaller numbers, most importantly or notably in Mykolainsky, and as the recent research has suggested, also in Husiatin. In the 6 cities and towns that I described, more Jews were killed than in several dozen other localities in the whole region of Galicia that I, in my previous research, could identify as places where Jews were murdered with local perpetrators during the first half of July 1941. And the number of victims from in these other places were between 3,000 and 4,000. Yeah, and what is, I think, even more important, or what distinguishes these places where the Waffen-SS was involved, was that they had here the share of the victims in the overall Jewish population of these cities and towns was much higher than in most other places. Here, between 8 and nearly 30% of the Jewish population were killed. In Lviv, for example, the number of victims of the pogrom on 1st of July was below or about 0.5%. In Boleslav, for example, where one of the bloodiest pogroms, except for those in these six cities and towns, took place, the share of victims among the Jewish inhabitants was below 3%. The Wiking division, as I said, was part of the combat troops and had no orders and instruction for mass killings of alleged supporters of Soviet rule, as the Einsatz, that means Jews, as the Einsatzgruppen and other units of SS on police had in these times. The Division Wiking's mass murder of Jews during their move through Galicia was an outbreak of anti-Semitic hatred in exceptional emotional circumstances created by the invasion of the Soviet Union. Before the Waffen-SS men had their first serious encounter with the Soviet army, they began their war against the Soviet Union by shooting Jews whom they identified with Soviet rule and Soviet prisoners of war. The rather surprising fact is that the atrocities of the Waffen-SS, except for Struve, had been either mostly missing from or had been described as Ukrainian pogroms in earlier research. This is especially striking for this enormous massacre in Ternopil. The identification as Ukrainian pogrom has been facilitated by the fact that in all these localities also Ukrainian militias and civilians participated in the violence, and that some members of surviving Jews rather focus on crimes of their Christian neighbors than on the SS men. Nevertheless, many reports clearly identify Germans or the SS as the main perpetrators. The reason why the massacres of the Waffen-SS mostly seem to have escaped the attention of researchers for such a long time seems also to be related to a somewhat stereotypical pre-existing concept about the correct character of violence from German and from lococide. In many reports of surviving Jews, the atrocities in these 6 cities and towns appear as wild outbursts of violence shortly after the German occupation. Such forms of mass violence correspond to the concept of pogrom that, however, in Holocaust research usually is not associated with the Germans, but with the local population, whereas the view of the Germans is that they conducted rather well-organized mass executions. In fact, I believe, as I've argued in the article somewhat more, that is in the Moreshet journal, somewhat more extensively, and also already indicated at the beginning of my talk, I believe that these concepts need some changes. On the one hand, many of the acts of violence from lococide, that means the Ukrainian insurgents and militias, were rather well-planned, targeted executions of those whom they considered to have been supporters of Soviet rule, and not spontaneous outbreaks of violence. On the other hand, the case of the Wiking division may suggest that more attention should be paid also to the factor of anti-Semitic hatred in explanations of the German mass executions by the Einsatzgruppen and other German units and their rapid extension during the first month of the war in 1941. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kai, for your illuminating talk.